Today on Empathy Unbound, I'm speaking with Jeff Sebo, a leading philosopher of animal and AI ethics, whose work asks how we can build a just future for all sentient beings. Jeff is many things, including Associate Professor of Environmental Studies at New York University, Director of both the Center for Environmental Animal Protection and the Center for Mind, Ethics and Policy, as well as the Co-Director of the Wild Animal Welfare Program. His research ranges from animal minds and moral status to AI welfare, pandemics and climate change, and he's the author of The Moral Circle and Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves, along with co-author books on chimpanzee rights and the ethics of food systems. Jeff also advises research groups on AI sentience and welfare, insect welfare and AI law, making him a uniquely important voice at the junction of animal ethics, AI ethics, and public policy. Wow. Do you ever sleep? there's a lot
Not
there.
as much as I should, yeah.
And just to sort of let the listeners know why I wanted to do this. So I'm about to embark on a PhD in philosophy and ethics and sentience, and Jeff is somebody I reached out to, was incredibly helpful in helping me develop my research proposal. And yeah, I look forward to starting in January. So I just wanted to talk to Jeff and to find out a little bit about what he does, his thoughts and processes, and to share that with the listeners. So I've got a lot of questions. I'm not going to get through all of them, so I'm going to dive straight in. You describe your work as helping to build a just future for all sentient beings, and I wondered what that phrase means to you in practice. A lot of people will have a understanding of sentience, and it may differ from what it actually means. So I wondered if you could explain what it means and why that's so important to your sort of central focus.
Yes. So different people do describe sentience in different ways. For me, sentience is the capacity to consciously experience positive and negative states like pleasure, pain, happiness, suffering, satisfaction, frustration. Different sentient beings are going to experience different types of states. Some might have more intense bodily pleasures and pains than others. Some might have more intense intellectual, emotional pleasures and pains than others, or different kinds, of course. But for all sentient beings, if they can consciously experience states with a positive and negative valence, states that they like or dislike, states that they want more or fewer of, then they really have a stake in what happens to them. It matters to them what happens to them. And for me, and for many philosophers, for many other people, that is a key condition, a key criterion for when they really have a kind of intrinsic value and deserve consideration for their own sakes in decisions that affect them. Now, I am open to the possibility that other types of capacities or relationships or features are sufficient for moral consideration too, but sentience to me definitely, or at least very likely, suffices for moral consideration. And so I really do want to both conduct in my own case and support for other people work that can advance understanding both of which beings are or might be sentient and what they want and need, and then what we owe them and what follows for our practices, priorities, and our policies. So that is why I emphasize that kind of slogan when I talk about what unifies a lot of my work.
So is there, and many of the questions I ask are going to come across as very naive, so apologies in advance.
No,
But
not at
is
all.
there such a thing as is there a sort of a scale of sentience? So humans are sentient, sort of full stop.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, chimpanzees, dogs, pigs are sentient, but at maybe the other end of the scale, I don't know, fish or birds or whatever, are you sentient or not sentient, or is there a sort of scale of sentience, if that makes sense?
That totally does make sense. And this is an area of active research and debate right now, and a relatively new emerging area of research and debate. So, one way to put an increasingly commonly held view is that whether you are sentient is all or nothing binary. Either you have feelings with a positive and negative valence or not. But then how sentient you are, that might come in degrees. In other words, how intense and prolonged your experiences are, how good or bad they feel to you, how good or bad they are for you, that might come in degrees. So, for example, we might think that if both an elephant and an ant are sentient, then they are equally sentient in the basic sense that they can both have experiences that feel good or bad to them. But it may be that because the elephant has a more complex brain and nervous system and a longer lifespan, that the elephant is capable of experiencing more intense, prolonged states of pleasure, pain, happiness, and suffering. And for that reason, if a house is burning down and I have to choose between saving one elephant and saving one ant, then maybe the stakes are higher for the elephant because I would be preventing more suffering in the moment and allowing for more happiness in the future. And so they are both sentient, full stop, but the elephant might have a greater welfare capacity and in that sense be more sentient.
And I guess there's, if I think about sex for a second, it just came into my head. I guess humans and some animals have sex and relationships for pleasure, and some animals and creatures have it purely for procreation, and it's just a furtherance of the species. So I guess that's an example of where it is on that scale, really. So what's the difference between consciousness and sentience?
Yeah, good question. And also, just to respond to your previous point, I think we may find for many species, if not all species, there are both and explanations, right?
Yeah.
So the evolutionary explanation of sex might be that it supports procreation and the extension of the species, but then the way that it plays that role is by using pleasure as an incentive for engaging in the activity. And so it might be that an individual organism has sex because it feels good for them. But then the reason it feels good for them is that it has this evolutionary advantage it was selected for, right?
Yeah.
In many cases, it might be that what seem like two competing explanations are actually two complementary explanations, and both of them are correct at different levels of explanation. But to answer your current question, the difference between consciousness and sentience, as I understand it and many other philosophers understand it, is that consciousness is part of sentience, a precondition of sentience. So consciousness is the capacity for subjective awareness, subjective experience. Basically, if it feels like something to be you, then you are a conscious being. This is what philosophers sometimes call phenomenal consciousness. And then sentience is consciousness plus valence, consciousness plus it feeling good or bad in particular. So we can imagine conscious states that are purely neutral, like pure color perception, that it feels like something to see the color red, but it might not feel good or bad, pleasurable or painful per se. It just is, right? So you become sentient when you not only have feelings, conscious experiences, but they start to feel good or bad. You start to want more or fewer of particular ones. And that, for many philosophers, is when you start to care about your experiences. They start to matter to you, and it starts to matter whether I give you more of the good ones or more of the bad ones, etc.
I think what in the note that I sent you, I think one of the things I mentioned that I was interested in was that something that confuses me. I guess is that we many people accept that animals are sentient, and have feelings, and show emotions, and all those sort of things, but we still have this almost split across the animal kingdom, in that there's some animals that we eat. There's some people eat. There's some animals that we have as pets and as companions, and there's
Right.
some animals we're happy to experiment on in whatever form that is. What is that cognitive dissonance? Is it what? Why
Yeah.
do we? How can we divide creatures that we know are sentient and have feelings and have emotions and all those things? How can we
Hmm.
divide them in such a sort of
Right.
a binary
Right.
fashion?
Well, one question is how to explain this, and then another question is how to justify it. I think there are good explanations of why we divide animals into these categories. In my view, there are not particularly good justifications of why we divide them into these categories. But as far as the explanations are concerned, there are different factors involved and a little bit of a spectrum. based on these factors. So, for example, we tend to extend more attributions of consciousness and moral status to animals when they look and act like us. So, for example, animals with large bodies, large heads, large eyes, symmetrical features, furry skin instead of scaly skin, 4 legs instead of 6 or 8 legs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We tend to see them as conscious more. We tend to see them as valuable more, in part because they look like us and they act like us. Also, of course, if animals are near us and we interact with them day to day, like cats or dogs in our homes, to a lesser extent, urban animals in our cities, then they might be more top of mind, and we might be a little bit more likely to see them as fellow creatures or co-citizens in some sense. And then, of course, a lot depends on how we socially classify animals. When we socially classify them as companions, then the role we give them in our lives is to be a friend or a family member, and for that relational reason, we might care about them more, attribute more consciousness and moral status to them. And then, of course, the reverse is true for animals with the reverse features. When animals look very different, for example, small bodies, small heads, small eyes, scaly skin, multiple legs, or when animals are really far away, or when animals are socially classified as commodities. For example, if the use we give them in our lives, instead of being a friend and family member, is being our food, or being a source of new knowledge, or being a source of new medical treatments or ingredients, then that all creates an incentive to look the other way, to see them as less conscious, to see them as less morally significant. And so generally, our intuitions about animals are going to be shaped by all of these cognitive and social and political and economic and ecological factors. And this is why we do tend often to attribute more significance to a cat or a dog than to a cow or a pig, even though they are all mammals, often
Yeah.
with comparable cognitive and behavioral abilities and familial bonds and so on.
And I think that a lot of people can somehow separate the fluffy spring lamb from the lamb chops that to eat. They just don't
Right.
connect the two of them together. And
Yeah.
it's something I've been vegan for getting on about 14 years now, I guess.
Mm.
And I've no idea why. I have no idea why it took me so long to sort of figure out. Hey, this doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And for me, it was a lot of it was around environmental considerations and things.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
then lastly, I sort of learned about it. Do you see a day where we'll look back and think, wow, people used to eat meat and fish. That's crazy. Do you think we'll get to that point, or is that just wishful thinking?
Well, I really think that we do and we must get to that point. And this is, in fact, one of the most common examples that people point to when they try to imagine what our successors will look back at our behavior and feel horror about, right?
Mm.
They will look back on the fact that we factory farmed animals, that we killed more than 100 billion invertebrates, more than a trillion invertebrates in captive settings per year, and even larger numbers of animals in the wild per year, even when plant-based alternatives were available to us. They will look back on that behavior with horror. Now, I think that is not a foregone conclusion. That is a possible future, and one that we can and should work towards. And I think the more that we work towards it, the more likely we make that future, and that is a good goal to have. But nothing is guaranteed here. So I think imagining that future can be a possible motivation for doing the work that will make the future more likely. But it should not be a source of reassurance that this future is somehow inevitable and we can just sit back and wait for it to happen.
Mm. And I think, and there's so much investment and funding, etc., behind animal agriculture. I
Hmm.
mean, billions and billions of dollars of sort of lobbying, both in America and Canada and the UK, Australia, all countries really. There's such a massive lobby behind telling us how
Yeah.
healthy it is, and we need milk for our bones, and we need to eat meat to get vitamins, etc. So
Hmm.
it's still hard, I think. What do you think there are learnings that we could take from how we've treated our fellow creatures and how we're learning to treat them that could be applied to how we interact with AI as it becomes more and more advanced?
Oh, definitely. So I think if the question is how can we learn from our history and ongoing relationships with animals to make predictions about our future relationships with AI systems, then I think there definitely are lessons that we can learn. Now, all of them have to be taken with a grain of salt because AI systems are not animals. This
Mhm.
is a very different context, but there are certain broad similarities that might be the case. So, for example, there are conversations developing now about whether AI systems are conscious, sentient, agentic, otherwise morally significant.
Mm.
And there is a knee jerk reaction that some people have to think, of course, they are not, because look how different they are, and look how different their behavior is, look how different their internal structures are, look how different their development is than ours. And this is, of course, a reassuring thought as well, because it makes us feel more comfortable with our current development, deployment of them, our current uses of them. But we know from our history of animals that there was a time not too long ago that many experts had exactly those reactions about non human animals, even evolutionarily
Yeah.
very close ones like other primates and mammals and vertebrates. And then in the fullness of time, we came to appreciate that the right kind of careful scientific and philosophical research could actually give us information about this and pointed towards different pathways towards their own distinctive kinds of consciousness and sentience and agency and moral significance. And so we have learned over time that we should give them the benefit of the doubt. We should actively try to understand their capabilities and their interests, and then we should treat them with an appropriate amount of protection. And unfortunately, because it took us so long to learn that lesson, we along the way also scaled up this global system of factory farming and industrial animal agriculture and other forms of animal use, and now these industries will take decades to dismantle, even if we
Mm.
decided collectively to start today, because we waited so long to arrive at these conclusions. And so as we look ahead to our relationships with AI systems, I think we can anticipate that we likely will, to some extent, have that same tendency to assume that they are not conscious, sentient, agentic, morally significant because of their differences with us, to go ahead and scale up global uses of them, and then to gradually wake up to the reality that there could once again be different pathways to consciousness, sentience, agency, moral significance, and then now that we realize this is a real possibility and that we owe them some consideration and decisions that affect them, it will once again take decades to dismantle these industries. And the stakes could be even higher in this case because AI systems will be more capable
Mm.
in some respects than other animals, more powerful in some respects than other animals, and they will understand our relationships with them and will to some extent be learning from and reflecting back our treatment of them. And so the stakes of these decisions could be significant not only for them but also for us, for their treatment of us or our relationships and how they affect both of us. And we can expect the same biases that have been operating with animals to operate once again with AI systems. When they look like us and act like us, when they use human language like chatbots do, we might be inclined to over attribute consciousness
Mm.
and sentience and agency and moral significance to them. But then when they look different and they act different and we use them for different purposes, like just running algorithms in a blank box, then we might be likely to under attribute these features to them. So yeah, I think a lot can be learned.
Mm. Because I mean, we've made mistakes like this, not even just with animals, with other humans. If you think back,
Of course.
not very long ago, 300-400 years ago, or even less, different ethnicities, different genders, women had no property owning rights. They weren't anything unless they were the property of men. People that were non-white were viewed as had less moral significance and could be owned by other people. And you think so again, and you look at the course of history, that's literally such a tiny amount of time since where we are now. So you sort of hope that all the mistakes that were made then would help inform what we
And
do now.
just to emphasize, these are not just past problems. These are
Yeah,
ongoing problems.
absolutely.
There has been a certain amount of progress, but there still is a lot of racism, a lot of sexism, a lot of other types of human prejudice, discrimination, oppression. And even when we make a certain amount of progress, we are always one election away, one economic recession away, one generational shift away from regression to some past state. So progress is partial, progress is delicate, and yet, as you say, we have at least made more progress with human oppression than we have done with, for example, our treatment of non-human animals, and we might worry that the same will be the case with these novel systems too.
So that's another question I want to ask. It's so big, so I apologize. But
Sure.
what is the moral and ethical obligation on the AI companies around AI safety, AI welfare? Because there's going to be things where something that's good for AI isn't necessarily going to be good for people
Yeah.
or non-human animals. How do you help people navigate that sort of that tension?
Right. Yeah, that is very big, but I like the big questions. This is what we should be talking about. So I guess we can break this down into two questions. One is, what are the responsibilities of AI companies around safety and welfare? And then another is, how should they navigate the tensions that might arise between safety and welfare? So regarding what their responsibilities are, I mean, in the first instance, we might say their responsibility is to effectively coordinate around a global pause on further AI development, because this is just too dangerous and too fast moving. And we should collectively stop here and adjust to what we have already created, and then only in the fullness of time, slowly, when we are ready, if we are ready, continue. Now, that just should always be said. Now, with that said, since global coordination around a global pause is relatively unlikely, we can also talk about what their responsibilities are, assuming that they do continue to scale up and develop and deploy
Mhm.
these systems. And a general point to make here is that we should not wait until we are certain that a certain kind of harm will occur before taking reasonable, proportionate measures to consider and mitigate that risk. As various kinds of harms become more likely and more severe, then more significant precautionary measures could be warranted. And this is true both for safety and for welfare. So AI safety is broadly understood as the project of making sure AI can be safe and beneficial for humans and other animals. And then AI welfare is broadly understood as the project of making sure AI systems can also be safe and beneficial for the AI systems themselves, that if and when they have their own welfare capacities, their own welfare interests, that they can have good lives too. And that brings us to your second question, because as you noted, if humans and animals and AI systems themselves are all stakeholders for AI governance, then there could be tensions and trade offs between our different interests and needs and vulnerabilities. So, for example, a lot of what we currently do in AI safety involves interactions with AI systems that at least would raise moral questions if we interacted with fellow humans or other animals in those same ways. So, for example, standard techniques involve boxing. This means putting AI systems in constrained environments to limit their freedom, to protect us from what they might do if they had more freedom. That would be seen as a kind of like constraint or imprisonment if they had interests like ours. We also have interpretability. This means basically reading their behaviors and reading their minds to understand their thoughts and feelings and behaviors and inclinations. But this could be seen as a kind of very intimate surveillance if they had interests like ours, right? Other examples include often limiting their situational awareness or actively deceiving them in order to test how they would behave in different circumstances. This would be kind of like a form of systemic deprivation of information or mass misinformation if they had interests like ours. And then, of course, various training techniques could cause suffering if they had the ability to suffer, a willingness to unplug them if they start to seem not aligned with us. That would be like killing them prematurely. And making them have thoughts and feelings that align with ours, that could be seen as a kind of brainwashing, right? In general, we think, no, if we matter, if we have our own interests and moral significance, then we should have a certain amount of agency and autonomy over what kind of thoughts and feelings and goals we can have, when we share those with others, what types of goals we can set and pursue given our thoughts and feelings. And if we deprive AI systems of those same privileges, then it at least raises moral questions. So right now, my main recommendation to AI companies is simply take these issues seriously, acknowledge that these are real questions, start assessing AI systems for safety relevant issues and welfare relevant issues, and start preparing policies and procedures for treating humans and animals and AI systems with an appropriate amount of moral concern. Because if we do all of that together, acknowledge the issues, assess the issues, and prepare the policies and procedures, that at least gives us an opportunity to try to find co-beneficial solutions that work for everyone, humans, animals, AI, where those are available, and then to navigate tensions and trade-offs thoughtfully where co-beneficial solutions are not available. So that right now is the main advice I have.
That's a great answer. And because when I think about it, when I've read your work and listened to other people that have similar views, I find it hard to see a downside to that. Is there a downside? Is there a reason? Is there a valid reason somebody can come up with say, yeah, we're not going to do that because ... Apart from speed to market, market share, all that sort of stuff, capitalization,
Yeah.
etc. But is there a morally justified reason why you might not do that?
Well, I definitely think that there are downsides to doing it, and both intellectual honesty and practical rationality requires acknowledging those downsides, not because they should cause us to not consider it, but rather because they should cause us to consider it thoughtfully. So one
Yeah.
downside just is what you mentioned. It does slow companies down. It gives them a disadvantage in the global arms race to develop artificial general intelligence. And there are real practical and political stakes to that because some companies are in the race because they fear that unless they win, some other more reckless company with worse values and priorities will win instead.
Yeah.
And there is, I think, a reasonable concern that absent effective global coordination, it would be a mistake for the companies with a safety and welfare mindset to unnecessarily hinder their ability to really compete in this global race. So that is one consideration. Another related consideration is that while there likely are many co-beneficial solutions available, or at least possibly co-beneficial solutions available, it is a reality that everything takes money, everything takes time, everything takes personnel. And to whatever extent you invest money and time and personnel in, for example, AI welfare research and AI welfare policies, that at least potentially is money, time, personnel you are not allocating to AI safety, biosecurity, other issues that really matter too. And I do think that we should acknowledge that these are issues and that there are other issues too. As I say, I think the benefits of doing this work thoughtfully very significantly outweigh the benefits of not doing it at all. But I think what empowers us to do it thoughtfully is acknowledging those downsides and then thinking, okay, how can we undertake a work in a way that minimizes these downsides?
It does seem to be a topic maybe akin to politics where you have you're either completely on one side or completely on the side. Whereas people are either, they're either blue or red. But with AI, it's either AI is going to destroy us or AI is going to save us. And
Yeah.
I'm guessing the answer's somewhere in the middle. Hopefully, closer to save us than destroy us. What
Mm.
are your thoughts on how you explain AI to somebody? Because the two groups of people. One group of people that see
Mhm.
AI as a tool. It's like
Mhm.
Excel, isn't it? Or it's just like a better Google. And to that group of people, and then the other people that just have a fear of what AI might
Yeah.
do to them if that's not the terrible wording of the question.
Yeah, of course. I like the way that you phrased the question because your phrasing made it clear that people are drawn towards these kind of binary and
Mm,
polarized positions, right? Either AI will create a utopia or AI will create a dystopia. And in reality, it might be somewhere in between, or it might be one of the extremes, but we really, or at least I think we really are not in a position to be sure one way or the other right now. Instead, what we have is a wide range of possible futures available to us, where there might be some small but non-zero, non-negligible probability of AI-induced utopia. There might be some small non-zero, non-negligible probability of AI-induced dystopia. And then there might be some larger probability of mixed outcomes somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. Further progress that results from AI and allows us to improve our scientific understanding of the world and make advances in healthcare and medicine and so on and so forth. But then that also concentrates wealth and power and misinformation and disinformation and political destabilization makes it easier for people to develop novel pathogens and it may be that utopia wins out. It may be that dystopia wins out, or it may be that it just amplifies the status quo of having a bunch of good and bad stuff happening at the same time, but even more so, right? Any one of those right now is on the table. And my view is basically, and this is a familiar view, this applies to public health risks and climate risks and other risks too. A mixed outcome is in some respects probably the most likely one, but the the big extremes, just because of how big they are, they do merit some attention and consideration. We should not rule them
mm,
out or wait until later to consider them just because they seem less likely or in some sense more extreme or in some sense associated with some political group that we think behaves kind of in a way that we would not personally endorse. That those would all be bad reasons for postponing serious consideration of these more extreme possibilities.
mm. It's very interesting you say that. So I think in saving animals, saving ourselves, you talk about the fact that human and non-human face are linked through pandemics, which we know
Hmm.
about the pandemic. Research the year before the pandemic, I think I said that the UK and the US were the countries best able to cope with the pandemic, and the UK we fell apart. The US had its own problems. Climate change, we have this extraordinary thing that I think 99% of scientists agree on, but
Hmm.
because it's in the future and because it doesn't affect the global north as much as the global south, we don't do the right things about it. And there's so many other catastrophes out there. So what what could public health, climate policymakers, what could they do to better understand how everything is linked together?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. They do, at least in the abstract, understand that everything is linked together. For example, a lot of policymakers in the international policy space and national and local too will endorse ideas like One Health and sustainable
Mhm.
development. And One Health is a policy framework that recognizes that human health, animal health, and environmental health are all interconnected. And that means that in order to better understand and improve human health, we, to some extent at least, have to understand and improve animal and environmental health as well, because we are all in this together. And then similarly, sustainable development understands that these health and environmental outcomes are broadly linked with economic outcomes as well. And if we want to improve our economies in a way that can be economically sustainable, then we also have to ensure they can be good for health and the environment and vice versa. And so at least in the abstract, governments do recognize the interconnectedness of all of these issues. Where it falls apart is in the specific applications and implementations. It is very easy and feel good to say, human and animal and environmental health are all linked. And of course, this is all linked with economic development. And we should consider all of this as one and all come together as a common shared set of governments to bring together a more resilient and sustainable future for all. This is very nice and easy to say in the abstract. But when it comes to really unpacking the implications for our energy systems, for our transportation systems, for our food systems, for our urban infrastructure, and how much we have to consider all at the same time in order, especially to build food systems that can be good for humans and animals and the environment at the same time, or urban infrastructures that can be good for humans and animals and the environment at the same time. That is a lot harder, and it takes a lot more political will because it requires confronting practices and traditions that are common, that are familiar, that are really close for a lot of cultures and religions, things like animal use in the food system, things like the presumption that cities are for humans first and foremost in urban infrastructure. And there the conversation is a lot harder, but this is where the conversation is really important. And this is why I want a lot of people to be working just in a lot of granular detail on regional context for food system reform, for infrastructure reform, so that we can have those further conversations.
It's interesting how quickly things can change. But in a small example, so in the UK during the pandemic, obviously nobody was driving, nobody's going to work, so the roads were quiet, and you could literally walk down the middle of the road. And we had instances where I guess our biggest wild animal is deer in the UK. Deer were coming into previously very typical urban locations, suburban locations, and sort of wandering around, sidewalks and fields. Like, my goodness, it didn't take long at all. Like literally a few months of no cars on the road, no people around,
Yeah.
for animals to start almost not taking back what was theirs in the first place. But you know what I mean? And I
Yeah.
worked in corporate real estate for a long time, and offices, industrial warehouses, data, all that sort of stuff. And I thought it was really interesting your work on cities and wild animal welfare. It's something that was never talked about when I was in real estate, that urban planning can be designed to benefit humans, which a lot of it doesn't even benefit humans now, but and wild animals together. And I wonder
Yeah.
what were some of the design or policy choices that could help bring almost that multi-species urbanism to fruition.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. There is this common presumption that domesticated animals are the ones with whom we coexist, and then wild animals are over there and just to be left alone, in a way that completely ignores the reality that we are increasingly reshaping the entire planet to fit our own needs and are directly and indirectly affecting wild animals everywhere. And so we increasingly do have this responsibility to consider how our consumption of land, how our development on land and these other practices are affecting them. So with respect to urban architecture and urban infrastructure, there still is a lot to be learned. And we recently launched the Wild Lab, Wildlife Inclusive Local Development Lab at New York University, in part to research these questions and provide guidance for policymakers. But some low-hanging fruit examples might include installing bird-safe glass on new and renovated constructions, and that reduces collisions that are bad for humans and birds. Installing overpasses or underpasses or wildlife corridors on transportation systems, once again, to reduce collisions that are bad for humans and animals at the same time. Reducing light pollution and sound pollution that are, of course, obnoxious for humans, but then also bad for birds and insects and other animals. Increasing habitat connectivity and trees and other types of nature, and ensuring that they have food and water and habitat sources for animals. And that both gives them a place to live and eat and drink, but then also places to escape to if we have natural disasters, pathways they can use to get from one place to another place. And then other types of urban policies are worth considering too. For example, we have all kinds of human wildlife conflict that could be avoided if we had better trash management policies, or if we invested in better fertility control programs. And then we could use, for example, immunocontraceptives to limit and manage animal populations instead of using lethal, violent measures like poisons and physical violence. So those are all low-hanging fruit. Now, wild animal welfare is also very complex, so we should avoid anchoring to our early policy ideas as obviously the correct ones. But these are plausibly good enough that we should implement them in experimental spirit, and then monitor the effects and have researchers and policymakers working together to try these out and then see what happens and then iterate and then improve on them in the future.
What are your thoughts on? I assume they call it the same in America, rewilding. So in the UK and Europe, so in the UK, in some places we've started to bring back beavers. There's talk about bringing back wolves in Scotland. We've already seen wolves being brought back into parts of Europe, especially across Germany, because what they found is that in lots of places the apex predator was removed, and we all know that everything knocks on. So we end up in the UK. There are major deer culls every year because the deer population is not out of control, but it's far more than it would be if there was a predator that was there to sort of control them. So is it something we do to feel we're doing something, or do you think it has practical application?
Yes, that is a really good question. I like the way you asked the question, because what your question gets at is that there can often be many different motivations for this kind of intervention. So one motivation might be animal welfare oriented. You might think this is ultimately better for the individual animals, for them to exist in certain types of populations that have a certain type of harmonious relationship, and this ultimately improves their welfare. But that requires making judgments like getting eaten by a predator is better than getting shot by a hunter. and
Yeah, yeah.
and and when it comes to the actual experiences, welfare states of the individual animals, that at the very least is not obvious, right? And so we would have to really understand, how do these different approaches to managing these populations actually affect them, not only at the population and species level, but also at the individual level? And is it in fact better for the individual being killed to get eaten alive by the predator, as opposed to being shot by a bullet, as opposed to never having come into existence in the first place, right? And those are pretty difficult questions. Now, another motivation might be more environmental, that we think certain types of animals have a role to play in maintaining biodiversity, in maintaining ecosystems, and that supports the air that we breathe and the water that we drink, and beautification and other environmental goods. And then there might be more kind of cultural factors, like certain people might have a certain affinity to an animal who they see as a kind of mascot for their region, or where there is some kind of cultural or religious symbolism, and so on and so forth, or just an attachment to history, right? To the way things were. Like, these are native species. These are the species who belong here. And I am not an expert on all of these different issues. I think a lot of research is needed on some of them in particular, like the differential welfare impacts of being eaten versus being shot versus never having come into existence. So all I will say right now is, I really want to make sure that those welfare considerations are on the table, part of the conversation. We should not simply make these decisions based on some combination of environmental and cultural considerations. At the very least, those should be combined with the animal welfare impacts of these interventions. And when we do combine them, I think we have to acknowledge that we really just are not sure right now which approaches to managing these areas are best. And so we just really need to invest in more research.
It's fascinating when he said his years are better to be eaten rather than shot, and almost in the same way, you may have a lion in a zoo lives to 40 because it doesn't have to hunt for its food. It's fed very nicely. It has a female lion on tap, etc., etc. Versus the lion in the wild lives to 20. But so therefore should all lions be in zoos? I think neither you or I would say yes. But if longevity of life and easy life is
Mhm.
our main focus, then maybe hey, all animals should be looked after by humans. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
no, no, and then the other thing, and this is this is one of the things being a vegan I always find not amusing, but when people talk about, and it's okay because the animals are humanely slaughtered. I just think
Mm-hmm.
humanely slaughtered is such an oxymoron.
Right.
So you're killing them and playing nice music, or you're massaging them when you sort of slit their throats. What are you doing? But
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then in the same way, he talks about animals that we resonate towards. I think is it California has
Mm-hmm.
the bear on its flag. So I think in Europe,
Mm-hmm.
lots of countries very associated with wolves and things. But probably more important is our population of insects and bees and pollinators, all those things that we don't ever think about. Actually, making sure
Mm-hmm.
we have enough of those in the wild as well is
Mm-hmm.
probably more important than having the big fluffy animals in the wild. Back to what you said at the beginning, that we
Mm-hmm.
resonate to animals that look like us, or we can stroke and cuddle and think, yeah, we've got a soft toy wolf or bear. We don't tend to have a soft toy, yeah, arachnid or little insect, do we? So it's funny how we think about
Mm-hmm.
them differently.
Yeah, that's right. And it is worth noting that a lot depends on questions about, for example, insect welfare and these other large populations of small animals. We tend
Mm,
to think about these small populations of large animals when we intuitively assess, for example, wild animal welfare. Like we think about how the elephants are doing instead of how the ants and the bees and all of these other animals are doing. But,
yeah.
for example, the world contains what, about 400,000 African elephants. The world contains quadrillions of ants, quintillions of insects
Mm,
alive at any given time. And even if an individual elephant can suffer much more than an individual ant, even if an individual elephant matters much more than an individual ant, the sheer total number of ants, it really adds up. And if they have good lives or if they have bad lives, that could end up making a huge difference as to the
yeah.
overall welfare levels of the wild animal population. So yeah, I really do think, in addition to considering wild animal welfare more in general, we also need to be considering invertebrate welfare and small animal welfare more in particular.
Yeah, it's just we don't get big campaigns. We get big campaigns to save the whale or save the otter or save the dolphins because they
Yeah,
again not that necessarily look cute, but they're big and majestic and things. But
they're charismatic. Yeah,
they're charismatic, great word. But yeah, whereas insects, I guess we just don't have the same level of understanding because most of what they do goes on without our knowledge, and but without them, you think the planet would sort of collapse if things weren't pollinated.
yeah.
We'd be in a pretty bad state. Well, one of the things I wonder, so when you teach courses to students for the first time and they come into you and they're hearing about animal minds, moral status, the Anthropocene, and all these really big, complex topics, do you sometimes find that students will leave the room and just look stunned? How do you how do you almost help them deal with all that moral uncertainty without becoming sort of paralyzed by almost too much knowledge or oh gosh, I don't know enough about this. Where do I go? I'm completely confused now with everything I've ever thought was wrong now. How do you help them get through that stage?
Yeah, yeah. I will say we have wonderful students in our
Mhm.
animal studies program and environmental studies program in our law school, other places where I teach at NYU. And the students really are excited to learn, excited to challenge their beliefs and values, excited to think about how they can participate in making the world a better place. And so I think it really is a privilege to work with these students, and I might have it lucky in that way. But with that said, it can be overwhelming, even for students who are really grounded and driven. It can be overwhelming. And so part of what I do is just provide a kind of scaffolding to our discussions and say, hey, I recognize this can be overwhelming. This has been overwhelming for me. It remains overwhelming for me. And it might, for the first half of the semester, feel like we are wallowing in all of the mistakes humanity is making and all of the challenges that we face. But we are not doing that just for the sake of doing that. We are doing that so that we can be informed when we start to think together about possible solutions and ways of making progress. And so by providing them with that kind of narrative arc where during those sessions that are kind of overwhelming, they can appreciate that the role of this is to help me be properly informed so we can be laying the groundwork for an actually thoughtful discussion of solutions that might actually work. That sort of helps them see the light at the end of the tunnel and helps them appreciate there will be some agency that we can take back by the end of the semester and some ideas that we can explore by the end of the semester. And I think it also helps to connect big global issues with concrete, specific local manifestations. So, yeah, we have this big global issue of factory farming and industrial animal agriculture. We have this big global issue of wild animal suffering, wild invertebrate suffering. But then we have these local questions about what I and my family eat for dinner, questions about how I can work with my school to put some bird safe stickers on windows or replace the glue traps with something more humane for local wild animals and so on. And and so helping people to understand that these are global issues and we do ultimately need to be working together towards policy interventions, but then seeing that there are also these small steps that we can take in our lives and they can help some small number of animals locally, but that they can also reinforce our own commitment to keeping our eye on the global thing and working together to achieve the global thing too. I think that often, in my experience, helps.
That's very interesting because sometimes as a vegan, as somebody that's plant based, whatever, it can feel a bit hopeless. You think, well, gosh, we're never going to change everything. But
Yeah, yeah,
I really liked to hear you say that actually some of the smaller changes. Like we've got Christmas coming up here, so I'm going to make a sort of plant based meal for the family. They're not vegan, but they'll
yeah,
eat it, and it just maybe starts a conversation. And
yeah,
I do think the small things can make a difference, and that's really,
yeah.
yeah, that's really empowering
You
to hear.
do you do what you can and you recognize that you are part of a division of labor and an intergenerational project. Like the goal cannot be total animal liberation within my lifetime. The goal instead has to be setting up the next generation to go farther, building momentum in the right direction. And if we can measure our work that way, like are
Mm,
we building the knowledge, the power, the political will that is needed to do a little bit more in 10 years than is possible now? Then I think we can be really proud to have helped some animals along the way while building momentum in the right direction and letting the next generation go a little bit farther. And that to me would be a life well lived, a career well spent, etc.
mm. And given your focus on wild animal suffering, potentially sentient AI, lots of challenges around pandemics, climate change, or whatever. So you haven't really picked the easy topics. How do you personally avoid either feeling burnt out or feeling that this just isn't going the way I want it to go? How do you look after your own mental well being?
I think it can help to create personal incentives. I mean, we are ultimately humans driven by human interests and concerns and for me I am lucky in that I happen to really enjoy the work that I also hope is contributing to building knowledge, building power, building political will in the right direction. I love the activity of doing philosophy. I love the activity of learning about the social sciences, the natural sciences, law and policy. I love working on big collaborative projects and teaching and talking with students and going around and giving talks and meeting different communities and hearing about their own local version of a problem and kind of integrating that into my understanding of an issue. And and finding that marriage between something you think is important and neglected and at least potentially tractable, but then it also speaks to your background and interests and some what makes you wake up and feel like excited to start the day. That I think is the key. It would be a mistake to rely solely on moral conviction to motivate you to work hard every day. You
Yeah.
also have to build in incentives that just allow you to have fun and spend time with people you care about and so on. And when you can do that, then I think it helps in all of those ways.
Hmm. Do you think that your 14-year-old self would be surprised at what you're doing today?
Maybe yes and no. I thought I was going to be an artist
Mhm.
when I was 14, and so I might be a little bit surprised that I have not drawn a picture in a long time, except birthday cards for my family. With that said, I definitely was interested in philosophy. I definitely was interested in kind of big global issues, and maybe I would not be surprised to learn that I gravitated in those directions, even if I might be a little bit surprised uh, or amused to learn that I gravitated in those directions and am devoting my life to thinking about these issues about animal consciousness and AI consciousness. Those were not really on my radar when I was in high school.
Well, I guess AI was yeah, it was, even though it exists, that it was thought was very differently, I suppose. And
Yeah.
I think, and thank you so much for your time. But finally, so for somebody, and this could be anybody, for somebody about to start their PhD who cares about animals, AI, global risk, but perhaps feels a little overwhelmed about the breadth of everything there is out there to cover, where would
Mhm.
you say there's the most neglect at the moment, or what do you think would have the most impact to be researching at the moment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that both the good and bad feature of where we are with animal and especially AI welfare right now
Mhm.
is that this is such an early stage for these fields. I mean, animal welfare has a 50-year, if not many century head start over AI welfare, and it is still early days for animal welfare, and then especially early days for AI welfare. And that means we still have so
Yeah.
much terrain that still needs to be mapped. And the downside of that, of course, is we have a long way to go before we can make meaningful progress that we can be confident about.
Mhm.
But the good news for researchers entering the field is that you have so much open terrain and you can really gravitate towards the problems, puzzles that feel most exciting or interesting or connected to your expertise, because this is not an area of inquiry where this has been happening for centuries and centuries and centuries, and now the only role you can play is being yet another interpreter of Immanuel Kant, or being somebody who does a subtle refinement on a subtle refinement on a subtle refinement of some view that was developed 200 years ago. This is an area where there is just ample opportunity to map the space and come up with new ideas or apply old ideas to new domains and so on. And so I think that should just give you a lot of freedom to explore, which is pretty great.
Perfect. And it's interesting to say that, 'cause I remember when I had a discussion with my and to be supervisor, I'm sort of saying, like, yeah, because some people must just do a PhD on the brushstrokes Leonardo da Vinci used to paint the Mona Lisa.
Yeah.
Is building on what already exists. Whereas you think, okay, right, AI and animal welfare, okay,
Mhm.
go. It's
Right.
because there's so much out there already, but like, so
Yeah.
you are hopefully building and creating newness as opposed to just refining
Yeah.
what somebody else already created. So
And to be clear, I love that they're interpreters of Immanuel Kant. I think Immanuel Kant is
yeah.
super interesting. But the present point is that it is a little bit easier to find your own distinctive role in a relatively new field where less work has been done so far. And so I think that advantage you should lean into.
Thank you so much for your time. I really really appreciate it, and I yeah, hope we get to stay in touch, and I'll share what I'm doing with you. And yeah, it's
Absolutely. Yeah.
you've done fabulous things. I think you're an inspiration to lots of people, including me. So yeah, thank you for that.
I really appreciate that. Thanks so much for your time and really enjoyed this conversation.